The guitar passed between them, and the room held its breath. Greenwich Village, 1968. A third-floor apartment above a record shop on McDougal Street. The kind of place where musicians gathered after shows, after sessions, after the official world stopped paying attention. Exposed brick walls. A single window letting in amber streetlight. Wooden floor worn smooth by decades of footsteps. An old couch. A few chairs. The smell of coffee and tobacco. 11 people in the room. Most of them musicians. Some whose names would fill history books. Others who would remain footnotes, their contributions forgotten by everyone except the people who were there that night. Bob Dylan sat on the edge of the couch, his acoustic guitar resting across his lap. He'd been playing for the last 20 minutes, new songs, half-finished ideas, the kind of raw material he only shared in rooms like this. People listen the way you listen when Bob Dylan plays. Even musicians who'd heard everything, who'd played on stages Dylan could only dream of, they listened. Jimi Hendrix sat on the floor near the window, his back against the wall, long legs stretched out in front of him. He hadn't said much all evening. Just watched. Smoked. Listened. The way he often did in rooms full of people, present but separate, there but somehow elsewhere. Someone asked Dylan about his new album. Someone else asked about going electric at Newport. The conversation moved in circles the way late-night conversations do, touching on music and philosophy and the state of the world, never quite landing anywhere. And then Dylan said something that changed the temperature of the room. You know what's harder than electric guitar? He wasn't looking at anyone in particular. Just speaking to the room. Acoustic. No effects to hide behind. No volume to fill the space. Just you and the wood and the strings. That's where you find out if you can really play. A few people nodded. Someone mentioned Pete Seeger. Someone else talked about the purity of folk music. Dylan looked at Jimmy then. Direct. Unmistakable. Acoustic is easy for you, right, Jimmy? The question carried weight. I mean, with all that electric stuff you do. The feedback, the distortion. Acoustic must feel simple. The room went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of people listening to music. The other kind. The kind where everyone suddenly becomes aware of their breathing. In that Greenwich Village room, Bob Dylan spoke with challenge in his voice. Acoustic guitar is easy. Can you play without electricity, Jimmy? Hendrix didn't answer. He simply reached for the guitar. And Dylan's world changed. Jimmy didn't move immediately. He took a long drag from his cigarette, stubbed it out in the ashtray beside him, and looked at Dylan for 3 seconds that felt longer than they were. Then he stood up. Slowly. Unfolded himself from the floor with that particular grace some tall people have, loose-limbed, unhurried. He walked across the room. 5 steps. His hand extended. Can I? He asked, gesturing to the guitar in Dylan's lap. Dylan handed it over. There was something in his expression, not quite a smile, not quite a smirk. The look of someone who's just set a test and is waiting to see if it gets passed. Jimmy took the guitar. Sat down in the chair opposite the couch. Settled the instrument across his lap, adjusted his position slightly. His left hand found the neck. His right hand hovered over the strings. He didn't look at Dylan. Didn't look at anyone. Just looked down at the guitar, tilted his head slightly, like he was listening to something only he could hear. And then he began to play. No announcement. No explanation. No. Here's what I'm going to show you. Just music. The first note was so soft people leaned forward instinctively. A single note, bent slightly, held for 2 beats, then released into a cascade of fingerpicking that sounded like water running over stones. Not fast. Not showy. Just present. Fully realized. Every note exactly where it needed to be. Jimmy's eyes were closed. His face showed no effort, no concentration. He looked the way some people look when they sleep, completely relaxed, completely elsewhere. But his hands were telling a story that had nothing to do with relaxation. His left hand moved up the neck with impossible fluidity, finding chord shapes that shouldn't work on an acoustic guitar, shapes designed for electric tension that somehow translated into this softer space without losing their power. His right hand, that legendary right hand, plucked and strummed and dampened and released in patterns that seemed to exist outside of rhythm, outside of conventional time. He played Dylan's guitar better than Dylan had ever played it. Not louder. Not faster. Not with more notes. Just better. Deeper. With a relationship to the instrument that made it clear the guitar wasn't a tool to him. It was a language he spoke more fluently than English. 30 seconds passed. Then a minute. The room had gone completely still. Hendrix didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. Dylan's expression changed. Slowly. Like watching ice melt in time-lapse. The challenge drained from his face, replaced by something harder to define. Not quite embarrassment. Not quite all. Something between recognition and resignation, the look of someone realizing they'd badly miscalculated. He'd meant to put Jimi in his place. To remind everyone that electric guitars were toys, that real musicians could strip it all down to wood and wire and still make magic. He'd meant to demonstrate the hierarchy he believed in, folk first, everything else a distant second. Instead, he was watching Jimi Hendrix make his acoustic guitar sound like an entire orchestra without breaking a sweat. Jimi transitioned into something that might have been a blues, might have been jazz, might have been something that didn't have a name yet. His thumb maintained a steady bass line while his fingers picked out melody and harmony simultaneously, creating the illusion of multiple instruments. Every so often, he'd strike the body of the guitar percussively, adding rhythm without disrupting the flow of notes. Someone in the room, nobody remembered who later, whispered, "Jesus Christ." Jimi didn't react. Didn't open his eyes. Just kept playing, kept following wherever the music was taking him. His face showed the faint trace of a smile, but it wasn't directed at anyone. It was private. Internal. The smile of someone having a conversation with an old friend. 2 minutes became 3. Dylan had stopped watching Jimmy's hands and was now staring at his face, trying to understand how someone could make it look that effortless. How there could be zero gap between intention and execution. How you could play something that complex while appearing to think about nothing at all. The answer, which Dylan was beginning to understand, was that Jimi wasn't thinking. Thinking was what you did when you didn't know the language well enough. Jimi was just speaking. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the meaning of this moment is still unfolding. Jimi began to wind down the piece. Not abruptly. There was no moment where you could say, "This is where it ends." The music just gradually returned to earth, the complexity simplifying, the cascades becoming streams, the streams becoming a trickle, until finally there was just one note, held and bent and released into silence. He opened his eyes. Looked down at the guitar. Ran his thumb across the strings one more time, so softly it barely made a sound. Then he looked up at Dylan. "It's a beautiful instrument," Jimi said quietly. "You take good care of it." He stood up and held the guitar out, offering it back. Dylan took it. His hands felt clumsy, suddenly inadequate. He looked at the guitar like he'd never seen it before. Like Jimi had changed something fundamental about it just by touching it for 3 minutes. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Dylan asked. His voice had lost its edge. Jimi shrugged. "Same place you did, I guess. Listening. Trying. Failing. Trying again." He moved back toward his spot by the window. "Acoustic, electric, doesn't matter much. It's all just guitar. You make friends with it or you don't." He sat back down against the wall, pulling out another cigarette. The room remained quiet for another moment, everyone processing what they'd just witnessed. Then someone, one of the other musicians, said, "Jimi, can you show me that thing you were doing with your thumb on the bass notes?" And just like that, the tension broke. Jimi nodded, gestured for the guy to bring his guitar over. Within minutes he was sitting on the floor with 2 other guitarists, patiently demonstrating a technique, his voice soft and unhurried, answering questions, offering encouragement. He never mentioned Dylan's challenge. Never threw it back in his face. Never claimed victory in a contest Dylan had started and lost without Jimi even acknowledging there was a fight. That was the thing about Jimi that people didn't always understand. He didn't need to win. Winning implied he was competing. He wasn't competing. He was just being what he was, completely and without apology. If that made other people feel small, that was their problem to solve. Dylan put his guitar back in its case. He stayed for another hour, but he didn't play again that night. Didn't join the conversation about techniques and tunings. Just watched Jimi teach these other musicians, generous with his knowledge, patient with their questions, treating everyone like they had something valuable to offer. In that quiet moment, Hendrix did something no one expected. Before Dylan left, Jimi stopped him near the door. "Hey," Jimi said, his voice low enough that only Dylan could hear. "That song you played earlier. The one about the Watchtower. You still working on that?" Dylan nodded. "Yeah. Can't quite get the arrangement right. You ever think about putting some electric on it? Real heavy. Make it dangerous." Dylan looked at him. "You think it needs that?" "I think it deserves that," Jimi said. "It's already dangerous in the lyrics. The music should match." He smiled slightly. "Sometimes electric isn't about hiding. Sometimes it's about revealing what's already there." Dylan absorbed this. "You want to record it? If you'd let me." They stared at each other for a moment. Then Dylan extended his hand. Jimi shook it. 6 months later, Jimi Hendrix recorded All Along the Watchtower. He transformed Dylan's acoustic folk meditation into an electric apocalypse. Guitar work that sounded like the end of the world and the beginning of something new. Dylan would later say it was the definitive version, that Jimi hadn't covered the song, he'd completed it. But that night in the Greenwich Village apartment, none of that had happened yet. That night was just 11 people in a room, a challenge issued and answered without a word of argument, and Bob Dylan learning that mastery doesn't announce itself. It just plays. What followed stayed with everyone in the room, long after the last note faded. The apartment belonged to a woman named Sarah Michaels. She was a painter who let musicians use her space because she liked having creativity around her. She died in 1994, but before she passed, she gave an interview to a music historian. "That night changed Dylan," she said. "Not in a big dramatic way. But I watched him leave and he looked humbler. Like he'd had a conversation with God and realized he wasn't as close to the throne as he thought." She laughed. "But the thing about Jimi, he didn't even know he'd done it. He was just playing guitar. Being himself. He had no idea he just shattered someone's ego. That's what made him dangerous. Not the volume or the effects. Just the complete absence of doubt. Of the 11 people in that room, 4 became famous enough that their names are remembered. 7 didn't. But all of them, if you'd asked them years later what they remembered about the 1960s music scene, would tell you about that night. About the challenge. About the silence. About Jimi Hendrix picking up an acoustic guitar and proving that mastery doesn't care about the tools. Dylan never challenged another guitarist again. Not in jest, not in earnest. He'd learned something that night that most people never learn. Mastery doesn't argue. It simply is. Years later, a journalist asked Dylan about Jimi Hendrix. What was he like? What made him special? Dylan was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Jimi didn't need the guitar to prove he was great. The guitar needed Jimi to show what it could be." Share and subscribe. Some stories deserve to be remembered. The acoustic guitar from that night stayed in Dylan's collection until he died. He never sold it. Never let anyone else play it. When asked why, he'd just shake his head. Some instruments carry memory. Some moments change you. Some nights you meet someone who shows you the difference between being good and being inevitable. Jimi Hendrix was inevitable. And everyone who ever challenged him learned that the hard way. In silence,